Welcome back to week 39 of our journey through the Word. We finally have the biggest part of our genealogies behind us. And now we go through some review of things that we've already seen. But it's almost like God says, I want you to get this solidified in your mind and in your heart. And so now we have our review of things that we've already looked at, things that we've already seen in 2 Samuel, we are going to see again. Some of it has a little more detail. We are told again of Saul's death and the death of his sons, and how the Philistines carried away the news of Saul's death to their idols, and they put Saul's armor in the house of God, of the gods. And so this obviously was a cultural thing that was done in that time. When you had victory over your enemies, you brought a token of that victory to the gods in recognition that you believed it was the gods who gave you that victory. We see David do the same thing. When David took the sword of Goliath and brought it to the priests in the tabernacle. We also see that the Philistines took Saul's head and they brought it to the house of Dagon. And we may remember that when they won the victory over the Israelites and they captured the ark, where did they take it? They took it to the house of Dagon, their chief god. And you may remember that Dagon couldn't stand before the ark of God. I'm sure Dagon has no problem standing before Saul's head. And the next thing that we come to is that David and his men go to take Jerusalem. This is also an interesting thing to consider, because we see the Philistines take Saul's head to the house of Dagon. And yet when David had his battle with Goliath, we see David cut off Goliath's head and he takes it to Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? I mean, when we now look, David and his men go to Jerusalem and they are going to capture the city of Jerusalem. We know that that Jerusalem had been captured once before, but it fell back into the hands of the enemy. And so now David comes and he goes to Jerusalem and he's determined that he is going to gain the control of this city. It's a very interesting thought to consider, because Jerusalem, as we look at Jerusalem, we find that Jerusalem actually laid in the territory of Benjamin. And it was the border city that divided the territory between Judah to the south and Benjamin to the north. So why does David want this city? Obviously, Jerusalem held a strategic place in the minds of the Israelites. And yet Jerusalem is not on a direct trade route, which would make it very desirable. But we find that Jerusalem, even way back, we got to go back to the time of Abraham, and we find that Jerusalem is considered the epicenter of spiritual activity. We remember that when Abraham is returning from the battle, when he goes and rescues Lot and the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, that it is Melchizedek, who is the priest of Salem, who comes out. You remember the story. And he comes out and he meets Abraham. And so we see it is the Melchizedek priesthood that is valued so highly, and the city over which Melchizedek rules. And so David goes to Jerusalem, and when he comes to, it was called Jebus before it's called Jerusalem, and the Jebusites come and say, David's not entering here, and you'll read all about those things. And so David and his men conquer Jerusalem. And as a result of that, Jerusalem takes on a new status. In 2 Chronicles 6, verses 5 and 6, God says this: "Since the day that I brought my people from the land of Egypt, I did not choose a city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. Nor did I choose any man for a leader over my people Israel. But I have chosen Jerusalem, that my name might be there. and I have chosen David to be over my people, Israel. And so we see a new status given to Jerusalem. Jerusalem no longer belongs to Judah or to Benjamin. God says, now I want you to know I've chosen Jerusalem to be mine. This is where my name will dwell. And God says, now, and I want you to know from this point on, I have chosen David and his descendants to be over my people, Israel. We see something very similar to this in the United States. Washington, D.C., which is Washington District of Columbia, is on a border as well. It's on the border of Virginia and Maryland. And yet, if you say, what state does Washington, D.C. belong to, you're going to find that it doesn't belong to either one. It is a district within itself. And I believe that's what happened with Jerusalem. Jerusalem no longer belongs to Benjamin to the north or to Judah in the south. It is a city that is a city of its own. It belongs to God. Then we go on to see the key people once again mentioned in David's life, the mighty men who came to David when he was in Ziklag. And they are enumerated for us once again. Then the elders and the warriors from each tribe come to David when he's in Hebron and make him king over all Israel. From the time that David was anointed by Samuel until the time when they all come to make David king is approximately 20 years. That's a long time. But David, he waits and he passes that test and is made king over all of Israel. We are once again reminded of the time when David makes his first attempt to bring the ark into Jerusalem. It's interesting to think about how the ark, how many times the ark is separated from the tabernacle. And we see David's desire not to bring the ark to the tabernacle, but to bring the ark to where he lives and to bring the ark into Jerusalem, God's city. And as he's bringing it that first time, we remember that he brings it in on a cart. And it's Uzzah and Ahio that are the ones who are driving this cart when it's upset by the oxen and when they stumble. But when David goes to God, between the first attempt and the second time that he does bring the ark to Jerusalem, we see David get before God, and David does his homework. We know he does because we hear David say these words. He says, "For we did not seek him, Yahweh, according to his ordinance." In other words, David says, we didn't check and see how God desired things to be done. If we look at the word ordinance, the word ordinance literally means according to his judgments and his decisions. And so David recognizes that he had a good idea, but he had a wrong execution. And so David saw that God had appointed a way. He had made a judgment on how the ark was to be carried. And so David appoints the Levites to carry the ark of God on their shoulders, just as God had commanded Moses and according to God's word. And so he appoints Heman and Asaph and Ethan to lead the way. As we look at Heman, Asaph, and Ethan, we find that they are representatives of all three divisions of the Levitical priesthood. And he tells them that they are to lead the ark with specific musical instruments. And as he tells them, he says, now there are 8 priests that are to carry the ark according to the alamot. We read that and it makes no sense to us. And unfortunately, the translators often don't translate this very well. Perhaps they don't understand, is the only thing I can think of. Because literally, what does alamot mean? It means the voice of maidens. And so there were 8 priests that were to carry these harps that were tuned to the high pitch, the voice of maidens. But then he says there are 6 priests who are to carry the lyres that are to be according to the Shemnit. So what is the Shemnit? Shemnit means the 8th. The 8th what? If we go back into the Talmud, it will give us a bit of understanding of this 8th. According to the Talmud, it says that the harp of the Holy of Holies was to be 7 strings. But we find that these harps are to be of 8 strings. In Jewish tradition, 8 strings symbolizes redemption. And so now we see that the 8th string represents the day of the Messiah and his kingdom, and also it represents redemption. So what does the 8th string represent? It represents the Messiah who brings redemption. And so what is the sound that's heard as they're bringing in the ark? It's the sound of the voice of the maidens, the voice of the bride, and it's the sound of the Messiah, the voice of the bridegroom. Then David gives instructions and structure to those who are in charge of the expressions of the praise in both the tabernacle and at the ark itself. And so David assigns gatekeepers who are to be there to protect it, to guard the ark. And I want you to notice there's a name that's mentioned in this, Obed-Edom. And I want you to, as you're going through chapters 15 and 16, take time as you're going through to count how many times Obed-Edom's name is mentioned. It's rather an interesting calculation. So count them and see how many times in chapters 15 and 16 Obed-Edom's name is mentioned. And then we see that David gives specific assignment to Asaph and his relatives, and they're assigned to the ministry that's before the ark that's in Jerusalem. Obed-Edom and his relatives are assigned as gatekeepers of the ark. And then we see the priesthood, Zadok, the priest, and his relatives who are left to minister before the Lord in the tabernacle in Gibeon. And so we find that the tabernacle continues to function. Although the ark is in Jerusalem, the sacrifices that were made and the daily sacrifices and the sacrifices that were relative to the appointed times continue to take place at Gibeon before the tabernacle and at the tabernacle. And that is until the time that the temple is completed. We are reminded again of David's deep desire to build the temple. But once again, David is in great danger of getting ahead of God. And God mercifully comes and lets David know, you're not the one who will build my house. As we read this interaction with God and David once again, we are reminded that although God says to David, you are not going to be the one to build my house, but in this, God promises David that he will build a house for David. After this, we come to the battle of the Ammonites and the killing of the relatives of Goliath. As you go through that, again, I encourage you to pay special attention to the individual who kills the giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. It'll give you a little insight into David's family and his relatives. And then David begins to make preparations for the temple. And it tells us of the tremendous amount of gold and silver and bronze and timber and stones that David collects. And then we see David charge his son Solomon with the task of building the temple. And listen to to David as he charges Solomon, and the blessing he gives to Solomon. And he tells him, may God give you discretion and understanding. When we look at those two words, may God give you discretion. Discretion is the word sakal, and the word sakal is a type of wisdom. Just as in our English language, we have different words for wisdom. We have the word wisdom, which means to make a good decision. And we also have the word prudence. Although prudence is wisdom, there is another nuance to the word prudence. It is the same in Hebrew. There is the word for wisdom, chokhmah, and that means to make good decisions or to have good wisdom. But there is the word sakal. And the word sakal is relative to our word prudence. What is the difference between wisdom and prudence? What is it that David is asking for Solomon? He's saying, I just don't ask God to give you the ability to make good decisions. I ask that you will have prudence. Prudence is wisdom, but it shows the way you came to make a good decision. In this word sakal, it shows a process of reasoning through much material and looking at the pros and the cons and the advantages and the disadvantages. And as a result of looking at all those things, you come to a very prudent decision. And so he says, may God give you that ability to sort through and to look at all the information that you're going to have to look at to come to a right decision on how to build things for the house of God. And he says, and may he give you understanding. The Hebrew word banah. The word banah means may he give you insight. And so David is asking God to give his son a very, very special ability to reason and to process and to gain insight and come to right decisions. So when later on, when we see Solomon ask God for wisdom, we will look at what kind of wisdom did Solomon ask for. I have no doubt that Solomon was prompted to ask for these things by his father. And so next week, we will continue to see as David prepares Solomon and the leaders for the vast undertaking of building this temple. So keep trekking through the pages of the book as God lays the foundations for our journeys ahead. I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great week.